I want you to think back on the last time you walked out to your tomato plants full of hope. Maybe it was June. Maybe it was July. And you found the leaves curling yellow at the edges, the blossoms dropping off before they ever became fruit, or a plant that grew tall and green and leafy and gave you next to nothing to show for it come August. I have heard that story from more folks than I could ever count, and every one of them tells it the same way, with a kind of quiet embarrassment, like they did something wrong and could not name what it was. Maybe you watered it faithful every evening, pulled every weed within reach, staked it up proper against the wind, and still stood there in late summer, counting a handful of small, split, sorry-looking tomatoes where you had pictured baskets full. I will tell you plainly, it was not your hands that failed you. It was that nobody ever told you what a tomato plant is actually asking for, and so you fed it the way the seed packet told you to, and wondered why the plant next door, the one some old woman down the road has been growing the same way for 40 years, always seems to outdo yours without half the fuss. You are about to give up on the best tomatoes you'll ever grow, for want of something nobody taught you. My name is Elias. My people came over from the Palatinate in 1838, a hard crossing by every account my grandfather ever gave of it, and they put down roots on the same piece of Lancaster County ground that my wife Esther and I still farm today. 6 generations of us have grown tomatoes on this land, and I promise you, not one of those generations ever bought a bag of fertilizer from a store to do it. My grandmother had a mix she made up every spring, something she learned from her own mother, and she kept the recipe the same way she kept her Bible verses, close in her memory, and passed along only when she judged a person ready to hear it. I was that boy trailing behind her with a bucket more times than I can count, and what she taught me about feeding a tomato plant has never once failed me in all the years since, on soil that has grown harder to work with each passing decade of weather. There were seasons on this farm, more than one, when a poor tomato crop meant real hardship at the table come winter, jars of sauce and preserves that simply were not put up because the plants had not given enough to spare. My grandfather used to say, a family that could not coax a proper harvest out of its own dirt was a family leaning too hard on the store, and he did not mean that as an insult, so much as a plain warning about where dependence leads a person. Esther and I keep a small market stand most summers now, more out of habit and pleasure than necessity, but the mix has never changed, because a thing that has fed 6 generations of a family does not need improving by someone chasing a quicker result. Here is the one thing I want you to carry out of this video, because it will change how you look at your whole garden from here on. Almost everyone has this backward. Folks think a tomato plant needs to be fed nitrogen, the same rich green growing food you would give a lawn or a leafy vegetable, and so they reach for a fertilizer heavy in it, and the plant answers exactly the way you would expect. It grows tall, it grows leafy, it grows into a great green bush that looks like the picture of health, and it gives you almost no fruit at all, because a plant fed mostly nitrogen puts its whole effort into growing more of itself rather than into making seed, and fruit is nothing more than a plant's way of making seed. It is not that your plant is sick, it is that you have been feeding it to grow leaves when what you wanted was tomatoes, and those are 2 different jobs asking for 2 different kinds of nourishment. The old mix my grandmother made was built around calcium and potassium and a touch of magnesium instead, the very things that push a plant toward setting fruit and holding on to it. And once you understand that difference, you will never look at a bag of all-purpose fertilizer the same way again. Think of it this way. A plant does not know the difference between a leaf and a tomato the way we do. To the plant, both are simply where it puts its energy, and it will always put that energy toward whichever job the nutrients in front of it are best suited to. Give it heavy nitrogen, and it builds leaf and stem, because nitrogen is the very building block of green growth. Give it calcium and potassium instead, in the right season and the right amount, and it shifts that same energy toward setting blossoms and carrying fruit through to ripeness. The plant is not choosing one over the other out of stubbornness. It is simply answering, honest and direct, to whatever you have handed it. Quick word before I go further. The old methods my family uses, there is more of it than fits in any one video. I gathered the whole of it into a book at Elias Yoder. Com. The book is the long version. If you want it, it is there. I will not mention it again. Now let me walk you through the mix itself, step by step, the way my grandmother walked me through it, so you understand the why behind every part of it, and not just the doing. You will need a gallon of water, a tablespoon of Epsom salt, a crushed up half-dozen eggshells that have been dried and ground fine, and a small handful of used coffee grounds that have already been brewed and cooled. Every single one of these is something most kitchens already have on hand, and that is no accident. The old ways were never about buying something new. They were about looking at what you already had and understanding what it was good for. My grandmother used to say that a farm kitchen threw away half a garden's worth of feeding every week, without knowing it, and I have come to believe she was right. Once you learn to see a kitchen scrap the way she did, as a piece of nourishment still waiting to finish its job, rather than as simple waste headed for the bin. Start with the Epsom salt. Dissolve the full tablespoon into your gallon of water and stir it until it disappears entirely. Epsom salt is magnesium sulfate, plain and simple, and magnesium is a piece of the chlorophyll a plant uses to turn sunlight into energy. A tomato plant short on magnesium will often show it in yellowing between the veins of its older leaves, a kind of pale mottled look that a lot of folks mistake for disease when it is nothing more than a hungry plant asking plainly for what it lacks. Feeding it back in through the water lets the roots take it up gentle and steady, rather than shocking the plant the way a strong chemical feed can. Next come the eggshells. Save them through the week. Rinse them out so they do not draw pests. Let them dry on a windowsill, and then crush them down as fine as you are able. A rolling pin over a cloth bag does the job well enough for most folks. Work that crushed shell into the soil around the base of the plant, not into the water itself, because eggshell calcium releases slow, over weeks, as the shell breaks down further in the soil. This is the calcium that guards against blossom end rot, that ugly dark leathery patch that shows up on the bottom of an otherwise fine tomato. Blossom end rot is not a disease you catch. It is a calcium shortage, plain and simple, made worse by uneven watering, and a steady, slow source of calcium in the soil is the surest guard against it I have ever found. The reason we crush the shells fine, rather than tossing them in whole, is that a whole shell can sit in the ground the better part of a season without breaking down enough to do the plant any good at all. Fine crushed shell gets to work faster. Then the coffee grounds, worked lightly into the top inch of soil, a small handful, no more, spread around the base, and not piled against the stem. Coffee grounds bring a modest bit of nitrogen along with them, but more usefully, they help the soil hold moisture and improve its structure over time, loosening heavy clay and helping sandy soil hold together better. I want to caution you plain here, because I have seen folks get carried away with this part. A little coffee ground worked in is a fine thing. A thick layer piled up against the stem can mat down and actually block water from reaching the roots the way it ought to, so keep it light, a small handful and no more, and never let it touch the stem itself directly. Once your Epsom water is mixed, pour it slow around the base of each plant, not over the leaves, about once every 2 to 3 weeks through the growing season. Watering it into the soil, rather than spraying it over the foliage, means the roots get the benefit of it directly, and it avoids any risk of leaf scorch on a hot afternoon, which can happen when moisture sits on a leaf under strong sun. That is the whole of the mix, the shells worked into the soil at planting, and refreshed once through midsummer, the coffee grounds a light touch every few weeks, and the Epsom water on its own steady rotation. Simple, cheap, and built from things most every kitchen already sets aside without a second thought. Now, the mistakes, because I have watched good, well-meaning gardeners undo their own effort more than once. The first is impatience. Folks will apply the mix once, see no dramatic change in a week, and go back to whatever they were doing before. Or worse, decide to double up the dose to speed things along. A tomato plant does not fruit any faster because you gave it twice the calcium in half the time. The plant works on its own clock, tied to sunlight and warmth and the steady building of its root system, and pushing more feed at it faster does not shorten that clock. It only risks burning tender roots with too much salt concentration all at once. Give the mix time, a full season if need be, and let the plant do its work on its own schedule. The second mistake is inconsistent watering alongside the mix, which is worth mentioning even though it is not part of the mix itself, because uneven watering is the single fastest way to undo all the calcium work you have put in. A plant that goes dry for several days and then gets flooded all at once cannot take up calcium steady the way it needs to, no matter how much of it sits in the soil, because calcium moves through a plant dissolved in water, and a plant under drought stress simply is not moving much water through itself at all. Keep your watering even, deep and regular rather than shallow and frequent, and the calcium you have worked into the soil will actually reach where it is needed. A good rule my grandmother swore by was to soak the ground deep enough that a finger pushed 2 inches down came away damp, done 2 or 3 times a week rather than a light sprinkle every single day, because a light daily sprinkle wets only the surface and teaches the roots to stay shallow and lazy, right where the soil dries out fastest under a summer sun. The third mistake is skipping the crushing step on the eggshells and tossing them in whole, thinking a shell is a shell regardless of size. I mentioned this above, but it bears repeating because I see it so often. A whole shell in the ground is doing almost nothing for a plant that season. Only fine crushed shell breaks down fast enough to matter within a single growing year, so do not shortcut that step no matter how tedious it feels standing over a rolling pin some evening. There is one more mistake worth naming, and it is the temptation to mix everything together in one big batch and pour it all on at once, Epsom water, coffee grounds, and crushed shell together, thinking it saves a step. Each part of this mix does its work on its own timeline. The Epsom water fast through the roots, the eggshell slow through the soil over weeks, and mixing them all into one hurried application does not speed the slow parts along. It only makes the fast parts harder to measure out right. Keep them separate. Apply them on their own schedules, and let each one do the particular job it was meant for. I want to tell you plainly, who benefits from you not knowing any of what I have just told you, and I want to be fair about it while I do. I am not telling you a man schemed this in a back room somewhere, deciding how to keep a simple eggshell and Epsom salt mix off your radar. No one had to. It is worse than a conspiracy, because it is a system nobody had to coordinate. A bag of commercial tomato fertilizer, blended and bottled and shipped across the country, sells for real money on a garden center shelf, and it sells better when the label promises fast, dramatic results a worried gardener is eager to believe in. There is no bottle to sell for a handful of eggshells you were already throwing in the trash. There is no shipping fee to collect on coffee grounds you had already brewed for your own morning cup. It simply pays better, all up and down that chain, from the manufacturer to the garden center, to the seed catalog with the glossy fertilizer ad in the back pages, to sell you a specially formulated product, than to remind you that your own kitchen scraps were already carrying most of what your tomato plants were asking for. Nobody sat in a room and decided to keep this from you. It is just that nobody in that whole business makes a nickel reminding you of it. Consider it plainly for a moment. A garden center orders a fertilizer by the pallet, marks it up, and sells it under a name meant to sound scientific and precise. Formulated, balanced, enhanced. Words meant to suggest that a plain old eggshell could never do the same work without some laboratory's help. And a worried gardener standing in that aisle, remembering a disappointing crop the year before, reaches for the bottle with the confident label, because it is easier to trust a promise printed in bold letters than to trust a habit passed down at a kitchen table with no packaging at all. I do not fault a soul for reaching for that bottle. I only want you to know there was a cheaper, older answer sitting in your own trash bin the whole while, and nobody selling that bottle had any reason at all to tell you so. Let me lay the whole of it out plain again, so it sticks with you. A tomato plant fed too much nitrogen grows tall and leafy and gives you little fruit, because fruiting is a different job than leaf growing, and it calls for different nourishment. The old mix works because it gives the plant calcium, magnesium, and a gentle touch of nitrogen and soil structure, built from things you likely already have on hand. Dissolve a tablespoon of Epsom salt in a gallon of water and pour it slow around the base every 2 to 3 weeks. Work fine crushed eggshell into the soil at planting and again at mid-season to guard against blossom end rot. Add a light handful of used coffee grounds to the topsoil every few weeks, kept clear of the stem itself. Water even, and deep, so the plant can actually carry that calcium where it needs to go. And above all, give it time, because no mix on this earth, old or new, homemade or bottled, will make a tomato plant skip its own season. None of it is complicated, and none of it costs you a trip to any store. Only a little patience, and the willingness to save what your own kitchen was already setting aside. Now I would love to hear from you. Truly, because this is how I learn the whole country from these comments, one letter at a time. Tell me down below what part of the country you are writing from, and what kind of soil you are working with, clay, sand, or something in between, because that shapes more of a garden's fortune than most folks realize. Tell me who taught you to garden, a grandmother, a father, a neighbor down the road, or whether you are teaching yourself from scratch this very season, with nobody's example to lean on. Tell me too what variety of tomato you are growing this year, and whether it is one your family has planted for generations, or one you are trying out for the first time on a whim. And tell me honestly, what did you always think you were doing wrong with your tomatoes before today? Overfeeding them, underwatering them, or simply not knowing there was ever a difference between feeding a plant to grow leaves and feeding it to make fruit? I read every single one of these comments, every one, and there is not a week goes by that I do not learn some old trick from a stranger in Texas or Maine or clear out in California that my own family never happened to pass down. That is a rare thing these days. A whole community of folks scattered across this country, all quietly keeping the old ways alive in their own gardens. And I am grateful for every one of you willing to share your own family's piece of it. If this video was honest and useful to you, tell a friend about this channel. That is the only advertising I have ever wanted, one neighbor telling another. Next time, I want to sit down with you and talk about the compost pile most folks are building wrong without ever knowing it, because there is a simple change to how you layer it that will cut your waiting time near in half. And once you understand why, you will wonder how you ever did it any other way, or why nobody thought to explain it plainly sooner. I think often about my grandmother standing over that bucket in the spring light, crushing eggshells she had saved all winter, never wasting a thing, never buying what the ground and the kitchen could already provide between them if a person only knew how to ask. That is the whole of what I try to pass along in these videos. Not some hidden trick, not some miracle, just the plain, sturdy knowledge that ordinary families, carried through hard winters and lean years, long before anybody thought to bottle it up and sell it back to us as a discovery. There is a kind of quiet dignity in growing your own food this way, in trusting your own hands and your own kitchen scraps over a glossy label promising more than any plant can rightly deliver. I have come to believe that a garden tended this way teaches a person something beyond tomatoes altogether, a patience and a plainness of thinking that carries over into the rest of a life, if a person lets it. The people who built this country with their hands did not need a laboratory to tell them an eggshell had calcium in it worth keeping. They needed only their own eyes, their own gardens, and their own mother's example, passed down at a kitchen table, the same way I am passing it to you now. Grow your tomatoes the old way, patient and plain, and let the ground repay you the way it has always repaid folks willing to listen to it, one honest season at a time.